It was less than a day since the ballots were counted in Kingston. The air still smelled of fireworks, and victory banners clung to lampposts like echoes of celebration. Prime Minister Andrew Holness, newly crowned with the people's trust for another term, had barely settled into his chair when the phone on his desk rang with an urgency that cut through the triumph. The secure line flickered, carrying a name no one in Jamaica expected: Ouagadougou State Line. On the other end waited a soldier-turned-president, Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, whose voice carried both brotherhood and warning. He began with congratulations, but quickly his tone darkened. Jamaica was not alone in its joy. It was surrounded by wolves. Western companies, smiling through investment proposals, were already plotting to carve Jamaica's bauxite and its sovereignty into contracts that promised progress but delivered chains. The Caribbean, he warned, stood at the same crossroads that Africa had once faced. Stay with us, because this is not just politics, it is survival. Subscribe now so together we guard the future no empire can buy. And so began a conversation that would shake Kingston, ripple across oceans, and ask, could Jamaica escape the trap before it closed? The clock in Kingston had barely ticked past the morning hours when Andrew Holness lifted the receiver. What should have been another congratulatory call felt strangely heavy, as if history itself pressed against the secure line. On the other end, Ibrahim Traoré spoke not with the flourish of ceremony, but with the urgency of a soldier who had seen too much. "Brother Andrew," Traoré began, his words measured, "the people have gifted you another chance. Do not let it become another chain." Holness hesitated. In his ears, the echoes of campaign songs still danced. Yet Traoré's voice, deep and deliberate, carried no music, only warning. He spoke of Africa's long scars, loans that became shackles, aid that hollowed out dignity, trade deals that drained nations while promising to strengthen them. And then came the revelation that pulled the Jamaican Prime Minister upright. "There are documents," Traoré said flatly. "Agreements drafted in European boardrooms. Your country's name is already stamped at the top. They call it renewable development. Solar farms, green jobs, sustainable energy. But buried inside is the truth. 20 years of bauxite extraction, profits funneled overseas, and Jamaica left to pay the bill." Holness frowned, his mind wrestling between disbelief and curiosity. "You speak as though there is a conspiracy." "Not a conspiracy," the Burkinabe leader replied sharply, "but a system. The same system that plundered us in Ouagadougou and Bamako, now moving across the Caribbean. I called not to frighten you, but to warn you that victory can rot quickly if you do not cleanse the table you sit at." The Prime Minister pressed his fingers into the polished wood of his desk, the weight of the warning sinking in. He wanted to dismiss it as exaggeration, as activist rhetoric unfit for the ears of a head of state. Yet a spark of unease began to stir. "If you claim there are documents, show them. Words are not enough." "You already hold them," Traoré answered. "On your desk lies a proposal from Renewable Horizons Limited. Flip to the third clause." Holness's hand trembled as he searched through the stack of folders. He found the glossy cover, bright with images of solar panels and smiling families, and turned hastily to the fine print. His eyes widened. "In exchange for infrastructure development," the clause read, "exclusive extraction rights to associated mineral reserves will be granted for a minimum of 20 years. The pen slipped from his grasp. For a moment the room spun. The flowers delivered earlier that morning, symbols of triumph, suddenly looked like wreaths upon a grave. "You see," Traoré's voice came, steady as iron, "they are already here." "And one of your own ministers placed his signature beside theirs." Holness's breath caught. Betrayal was no longer an abstract threat. It was ink on the page before him. His throat tightened as he tried to form words, but nothing came. He felt as though the celebration of his election had transformed overnight into a battlefield. Traoré pressed on, his tone grave but unwavering. "You must not mistake dependency for survival. Aid is not free. Investment is not always partnership. These are the same traps Africa fell into, and now they come for Jamaica. The wolves will smile while they strip you bare. Unless you act, history will repeat. Holness rose from his chair and walked towards the wide window overlooking Kingston's harbor. Cargo ships slid across the horizon, their containers stacked like bricks of another man's empire. He had promised prosperity to his people. He had vowed to lift wages, expand opportunity, build infrastructure. Yet here, within his own office, was evidence that prosperity came wrapped in contracts designed to tighten chains, not break them. "What you ask," Holness murmured, still staring out over the sea, "is to mistrust those who keep our economy afloat. Tourism, imports, finance, we rely on them. Cut ties and the dollar collapses." "No," Traore replied firmly, "not collapse, rebuild. Invest in your people, not in their loans. Show Jamaicans that you serve their future, not foreign shareholders. The people gave you this term not so you could polish their chains, but so you could shatter them." For a long moment, silence hung heavy between the two men, broken only by the faint hum of Kingston's harbor. Holness finally whispered, "If you are right, then I am sitting on a powder keg." "And truth," Traore said quietly, "always lights the fuse." Holness turned back to his desk, staring at the claws that had stolen the air from his lungs. One thought consumed him. If betrayal was already in his cabinet, who could he still trust? The morning of the cabinet meeting arrived with unusual weight. Andrew Holness, usually composed, entered the chamber with a stiffness his ministers had not seen before. Smiles and handshakes greeted him, gestures rehearsed, polished, celebratory. Yet to Holness, each grin looked like a mask. Ibrahim Traoré's words echoed in his ears. "Watch who sweats. Watch who avoids your gaze. The guilty always fear the mirror." As the meeting commenced, Holness cleared his throat and spoke with a firmness that cut through the chatter. "Before we discuss portfolios, there is one matter that troubles me. A proposal has landed on my desk, Renewable Horizons Limited. It promises solar farms and jobs, but buried in the contract is a clause granting foreign firms 20 years of mineral extraction rights. Tell me, gentlemen, who approved this?" The words struck the table like stones dropped in still water. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then small cracks appeared. One minister coughed nervously, fiddling with his pen. Another shifted uncomfortably, eyes fixed on his shoes. And one, just one, reached for his glass of water with trembling hands, sweat glistening on his brow. Holness's gaze locked upon him. He said nothing more, not yet. The meeting was cut short, adjourned abruptly with a declaration. No deals will be signed until further notice. Every contract will be reviewed with extreme caution. This is not negotiable. That night, Holness sat alone in his office, his mind restless. He lifted the secure line once again. "You were right," he admitted, his voice heavy. "I saw it today. One of them is compromised. But tell me, Ibrahim, how do I remove him without tearing my government apart?" The Burkinabe leader's reply came steady, carrying the weight of old battles. "You cannot cut rot in silence. If you do, the truth dies with it. You must expose the betrayal openly before the people. Only then will Jamaica be cleansed." Holness bristled. "Do you know what that would mean? Chaos. Panic in the markets. Opposition feasting on the scandal. My own party torn apart. And yet," Traore countered, "your people will stand. They always stand when truth is on their side. Andrew, leadership is not about balancing scales. It is about breaking the ones rigged against your people." For hours after the call ended, Holness wrestled with the choice. The safe path was silence, concealment, pretending the deal was a misunderstanding. But deep inside, he knew concealment would chain Jamaica more tightly than exposure ever could. 2 days later, he stepped onto the stage of a press conference broadcast live across the nation. Cameras flashed, microphones crowded the podium, and the room pulsed with anticipation. Ministers stood behind him, some defiant, others uneasy. Holness began slowly, his tone measured but sharp. "The people of Jamaica have trusted me with another term. That trust cannot coexist with betrayal. Today, I reveal to you a document signed in secret. A document that would have sold our land, our minerals, our sovereignty for 20 years disguised as investment. In truth, it was theft." Gasps rippled through the audience. Reporters scribbled furiously. The nation leaned closer to its television screens. Holness lifted the folder high, displaying the damning clause for all to see. Then came the thunderbolt. One of my own ministers was involved. He betrayed not only his colleagues, but the Jamaican people. The chamber erupted. Reporters shouted questions, cameras zoomed in, ministers exchanged frantic glances. One man, the same who had sweated in the cabinet chamber, turned pale as stone, his composure crumbling under the glare of the lights. Holness did not name him outright, not yet, but the message was clear. Corruption had been dragged from the shadows into the burning gaze of the people. Across Kingston, the reaction was immediate. Crowds poured into the streets, waving flags, chanting, drumming, and singing Bob Marley songs not as nostalgia, but as defiance. "Jamaica first," they roared. "No more chains!" The rhythm of reggae became the heartbeat of resistance, binding young and old in one swelling tide of pride. In Ouagadougou, Traore watched the live broadcast on a secure feed. A rare smile touched his lips. "Good," he murmured. "He has chosen truth." But in Paris, fury erupted behind closed doors. Officials slammed fists on polished tables. "He is exposing everything," one barked. "If Jamaica joins the Africans in defiance, our grip will slip further," another hissed. "Then we remind him who controls the markets." Cables were drafted, orders whispered, a quiet war already unfolding. Back in Kingston, amidst the chants and the flames of unity, Holness knew the path ahead was no longer his to walk alone. He had drawn a line in the sand, and the Empire had seen it. The announcement reverberated across Jamaica like a drumbeat. For decades, Jamaicans had grown accustomed to speeches laced with vague promises and quiet evasions. Yet this was different. Their Prime Minister had not only acknowledged betrayal within his own cabinet, he had dragged it into the light. In the streets of Kingston, Spanish Town, and Montego Bay, crowds multiplied. Taxi drivers honked horns in solidarity. Market women lifted their baskets high, chanting, "No more chains." University students painted slogans across placards, "Our land is not for sale." Bob Marley's voice thundered from speakers, not as entertainment, but as a rallying cry. What had begun as suspicion turned into a groundswell of unity. But beneath the euphoria lay the tremors of economic uncertainty. Investors abroad, unsettled by Holness's boldness, began withdrawing tentative offers. Rumors spread through the business districts. Would aid be frozen? Would the Jamaican dollar collapse? Shop owners worried about imports. Farmers feared rising costs of fertilizer. Civil servants whispered about pay delays. Holness's government felt the strain. His finance minister, anxious and defensive, urged caution. "We cannot alienate our partners," he warned. "Foreign capital keeps our hospitals running, our schools open." The opposition, seizing the moment, accused Holness of grandstanding, calling him reckless. Editorials in international papers painted Jamaica as unstable, suggesting its leader was aligning with radical voices in Africa. Yet for every critic, there were thousands who saw in Holness's defiance a glimmer of something long denied: sovereignty. Ordinary Jamaicans began to speak of dignity as if it were currency itself. "If Africa can rise, why not us?" asked an elderly woman in Clarendon. "Our ancestors fought chains of iron. Can we not fight chains of contracts?" Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré framed the moment as larger than Jamaica. In speeches to his people, he declared, "When Kingston rises, Ouagadougou does not stand alone. The Caribbean and Africa share scars carved by the same hand. But scars can become symbols of survival." For many listening across the continent, it was the clearest link yet between anti-colonial Africa and a modern struggle against economic dependency. In Washington, the State Department issued cautious statements urging stability and respect for international investment agreements. In Brussels, murmurs of sanctions began. Holness could sense the chill in the air, markets whispering, diplomats warning, allies hesitating. Yet in the eyes of the Jamaican people, a transformation was unfolding. Once disengaged from politics, citizens began organizing neighborhood forums, demanding transparency in every deal. Fishermen in Port Royal declared they would no longer allow foreign trawlers to dominate their waters. Teachers in rural parishes told their pupils, "Your future will not be written in someone else's boardroom." Still, the storm within Holness's own cabinet brewed dangerously. The compromised minister, though not named publicly, carried guilt on his face like a scar. Whispers swirled. Who was the traitor? Who signed the papers? Tension thickened. Holness knew silence could not hold forever. Exposure would eventually have to come. For the elder generation, those who remembered when Jamaica first declared independence in 1962, the moment felt eerily familiar. Then, as now, foreign powers whispered warnings, promised partnership, and extended hands filled with chains. "History is repeating," one elder said on national radio. "But this time perhaps we will finish the fight." The immediate consequences were undeniable. Instability in markets, anxiety in boardrooms, tension in politics. Yet the intangible consequence, the rebirth of pride, was immeasurable. Jamaica was no longer spoken of as a pawn, but as a nation daring to say no. Holness himself wrestled with sleepless nights. He walked past the bouquets that still lingered in his office, their petals withering, their colors fading. He thought of the farmer in Clarendon, the mother in Kingston struggling with school fees, the young man who told him he dreamed of leaving because Jamaica offered no future. Now, in their chance, he heard something else, a demand that he could not ignore. It was both the greatest burden and the greatest blessing of leadership. He had chosen truth, but truth demanded sacrifice. And so, as Jamaica stood at the threshold of uncertainty, one question echoed louder than all others. If this awakening in Kingston is what Africa and the Caribbean needed all along, will you, watching this story, declare it aloud? Write it in the comments. Africa and the Caribbean rise together. For while Jamaica wrestled with betrayal and survival, the larger struggle was just beginning. Because beyond the island's shores, powerful eyes were already sharpening their gaze, preparing to strike back. The ripples of Kingston's defiance did not stop at the Caribbean Sea. Within hours of Andrew Holness's press conference, the corridors of global power stirred uneasily. For what had seemed a local dispute over contracts was now becoming a beacon of resistance against a system long thought unshakable. In Paris, the reaction was immediate and furious. Ministers in closed-door meetings condemned Jamaica's stance as reckless, accusing Holness of undermining international confidence. One official declared, "If Kingston joins Ouagadougou in open defiance, the chain of our influence across the global south will snap." They spoke of markets, of ratings agencies, of teaching Jamaica a lesson. The very language revealed the old colonial instinct disguised in modern suits. In Brussels, European Union envoys whispered of legal measures. Could Jamaica be sued for breaking investment agreements? Could aid be suspended? Could trade privileges be revoked? Every conversation carried the same undertone: punishment. Across the Atlantic, Washington adopted a different tone. The State Department issued statements layered in diplomacy. "We urge stability and respect for legitimate business partnerships." But behind the phrasing, analysts saw the shadow of pressure. American corporations with stakes in Jamaica's ports, tourism, and mining quietly lobbied for protection of their interests. Washington did not want open confrontation, but it could not ignore the challenge Holness had posed to the accepted order. Elsewhere, new players circled. Moscow framed Jamaica's declaration as a brave step against Western dominance, offering mutually respectful cooperation. Beijing moved more cautiously, hinting at infrastructure partnerships free of political interference. For both, the Caribbean was no longer merely a holiday postcard. It was a front line in the battle for influence. In Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré addressed his people with fire in his voice. "Jamaica has lifted its head. This is not only their fight, it is our fight. When one island dares to say no, all of Africa hears yes." His words stitched Kingston's struggle into a larger tapestry of African development, framing it as a shared stand against economic colonization. Yet Holness knew that every ally came with its own shadows. Partnerships with Russia or China could not be embraced blindly. Dependency could wear many masks. The choice was not between East and West, but between chains and sovereignty. As global headlines debated Jamaica's fate, the island itself stood at a crossroads. Could a small nation withstand the combined pressure of empires cloaked in contracts and markets? Or would it break under the weight of retaliation? The eyes of the world were fixed on Kingston, and in the silence after the storm of commentary, one truth remained. Every defiance draws both allies and enemies closer, and with every ally gained, another enemy sharpened its knives. The night after the press conference, Andrew Holness stood at his office window, staring over Kingston's harbor. Cargo ships still glided across the water, yet they looked different now. To him, they were no longer symbols of commerce, but reminders of how easily sovereignty could be packed into containers and shipped away. He understood what Ibrahim Traoré had meant. This struggle was larger than trade, larger than contracts. It was about the soul of a nation. The path ahead was filled with peril. On one side lay retreat, signing the deals, soothing markets, keeping the foreign investors content. That choice promised short-term stability, perhaps even applause from Western capitals. But it came with a cost too great to name. The slow erosion of Jamaica's independence, the silent bleeding of its resources, the betrayal of its people's trust. On the other side lay resistance, refusing the contracts, exposing corruption, demanding accountability. This choice risked sanctions, financial strain, even political collapse. But it offered something priceless. The chance to stand tall, to ignite a fire that stretched beyond the Caribbean and lit the spirit of nations across the global South. Holness knew that Jamaica's decision would not be judged in isolation. It would be seen in Lagos and Nairobi, in Port-au-Prince and Accra. A small island's courage could become a rallying cry for millions who had been told that survival meant submission. In his conversations with Traore, the Burkinabe president reminded him of Toussaint Louverture in Haiti, of Nanny of the Maroons, of the men and women who once declared the impossible and made it real. The spirit of resistance, Traore said, does not die. It waits. And when one flame is lit, it spreads. For Holness, the burden was heavy, but for Jamaicans, the moment was liberating. Across the island, people spoke not just of politics, but of destiny. They remembered ancestors who had broken chains of iron and began to believe they could now break chains of paper. The choice, then, was clear. Caribbean nations, side by side with African states, could either accept the handshakes of empire disguised as partnership, or they could chart a new course, one rooted in dignity and sovereignty. As dawn broke over Kingston, Holness whispered to himself words that belonged as much to history as to the present. "We will not be sold." But even as he spoke them, he knew the struggle was only beginning. For every contract exposed, another would appear. For every traitor revealed, another would hide. And for every victory claimed, retaliation would follow. And so the question that lingers is not what Holness will do, but what we, descendants of the torchbearers, are willing to demand. When the echoes of the press conference faded and the chants on Kingston streets softened into the night, one truth remained. Jamaica had crossed a threshold. The battle was no longer about one clause in one contract. It had become a test of sovereignty, dignity, and destiny. Andrew Holness's choice to speak openly was more than political courage. It was a declaration that small nations need not accept their fate as pawns. In that moment, Jamaica stood shoulder to shoulder with Africa, bound by scars of colonization yet lifted by the same hope. It was a living reminder that anti-colonial Africa is not confined to history books. It breathes in every act of defiance against systems that seek to reduce people to resources. The road ahead will be turbulent. Foreign powers will apply pressure, markets will tremble, and allies may waver. But the Jamaican people have rediscovered a strength greater than any loan or aid package, the power to say no. In saying no, they have opened a door for a new conversation, not just about contracts, but about the kind of future nations like theirs can choose to build. A future where African development is not dictated by boardrooms in Europe, but by the dreams of farmers, teachers, workers, and elders who know that dignity cannot be imported. It must be cultivated from within. For those who marched, sang, and raised their voices in Kingston, this was not simply politics. It was the rebirth of a spirit carried from Maroon fighters in Jamaica to freedom struggles across Africa. And for the elders watching, especially in African-American communities abroad, it was a reminder that the struggle continues, that the fire lit centuries ago still burns. So the question now is not whether Jamaica can endure, but whether we, scattered across continents yet tied by memory and blood, will rise with them. Will we allow the same old chains to return in new disguises? Or will we declare as one voice that the era of exploitation is over? If this story stirred something inside you, do not let it end here. Like, share, and subscribe. Our ancestors fought in silence. Now we speak loudly for the future they dreamed of. Write it in the comments, New Africa. Africa rise. It's time for the Caribbean, because the story of Jamaica is no longer theirs alone. It belongs to every voice that dares to say, anti-colonial Africa lives and it will never bow again.